Awesome. So Martha, Ken, Susan, welcome to our open studio. I think, I think we can get started. We can walk through some of the design concepts, the design ideas, and as folks come in, I think, importantly, this is, just meant to be, again, a casual space for design conversations. So I think I'll start with just a couple of notes on that. And I know that Cindy will go a little bit more through logistics. We have a couple of different ways in which we'll give this presentation, again, given that we expect people to be joining throughout. But I just want to start with a few notes to those folks who are in this space. If you're able to be here in person, if we were able to have this charrette in person, this would be where we would throw open our doors and invite you all into our workspace to review our drawings, see all the crumpled up pieces of paper that started as design ideas that we threw away. This would also be, you would see all of our coffee cups and really feel a part of the process. And so this is a new approach for us, doing this in a virtual setting. And so we're really excited. Our design team has been collaborating, in a virtual design space that we gave a little preview of yesterday, and we'll do some more, in-depth conversations today around. And what this really is inviting you into the design discovery process. This allows you to sort of see our thought process, talk through specific design ideas and concepts, and give us information in real time. This is not about final recommendations. For those of you who weren't able to join any of our prior meetings, we really are at the beginning of this design process, and everything about this week is about learning. It's about testing. It's about pushing and pulling on different design ideas. It's about concepts and ideas, and hearing feedback on what's feasible, what's possible, what can work, what do we like, what do we dislike, so that we can take all of that information and over the next couple of months, continue to iterate, continue to build on that design process as we lead towards a second charrette, a design charrette in September, where we would be back and actually be talking about draft recommendations. So I just wanted to frame that so that folks sort of know that you're about to see a work in progress, and that's exciting, and we're excited to invite you into that. I also just wanted to make a note that we've heard some comments about how this project might invite unwelcome issues into Beverly Hills, things like crime. And we really want to address that head on. We know that high quality urban design creates welcome and safe spaces that cater to a real variety of needs. And that's the direction of our design process. We want to work to be presenting high quality urban design concepts that will make sure that we're creating these safe spaces for everyone. Later in the presentation, one of our designers is going to talk through a few sort of user journeys, user profiles, to understand our thought process in how to understand the variety of people and use cases that we need to be thinking about as designers. Now, that being said, if anyone is interested in having a breakout conversation on the topic of crime, on the topic of homelessness, I will make myself available to host a small sort of breakout session on that topic so that we can dig a little deeper. I'm the project manager, so it's my job to make sure that everybody's voice is heard. And I want to make sure that there's room for that so that I can take feedback and relay it back to the design process, while also making sure that we can have this sort of open studio design conversation on some of the different concepts that we've been working with. So at any point in time, feel free to drop into the chat that you're interested in that sort of breakout conversation, or just raise your hand. For those of you who are joining for the first time, if you want to raise your hand and speak, there is a black bar at the bottom of the Zoom window, and there's a button that says participants. If you click on that participants button, it gives you the opportunity to raise your hand. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Cindy, who's going to start sharing her screen to walk through a little bit about where our design team has been.
Awesome. Thanks, Nat. I could not have introduced this process better. Thank you. Again, we're sort of midstream here in terms of our thoughts and our process of what we, again, call discovery. This is really that discovery week. So thanks to all of you who have been in some really meaningful conversations from day one and through a lot of the stakeholder interviews. I see some familiar names in our Zoom. So thanks for being here. And what we're going to do, I just want to show you just kind of like what an open studio looks like in a virtual space. This is a lot of outpouring of information. It seems pretty small right now, but we've gone through a lot of different iterations of different information here. And we're excited to kind of bring you into the fold at this midpoint. And what we'll do is we'll kind of, this is a run a show or sort of what we're doing for today. Hopefully you can all see my screen. If you can't, let us know. You can chat us in the sidebar and we can try to help troubleshoot any of the IT issues. But the flow of the afternoon is to really go through from 3 to 4, we'll go through what we call round 1, and we'll share what we're working on. Feel free to chat your questions in Zoom or hold those thoughts until about 3:30. We'd love to open it up for a good discussion for a good half hour of the time. And then we'll have a round 2. We'll try to kick off again and go through all the information again from 4 to 5. And that will be another opportunity. If people drop in later in the studio, they'll be able to hear that as well. So really, again, like this is our I think the sort of nice way to preface this is what you'll see is what we've heard, some ideas about what we can do about it, and then let us know what you think. And that's really kind of the frames the day or the open studio space. Usually when we're in all together, this is how we manage it. So I'm not going to dwell. Let's see, who do we have on the conversation? I'll mention a little bit about most of the names I recognize here on the Zoom meeting, but give you a sense of what we've heard again and where we're at in the project. So again, our project location is really Wilshire and La Cienega. As you all know, that's our real focus is those two corridors. And where we're at in the project schedule, we are in still Charrette number 1, which is really, again, about discovery. And we're here on day 3 and really focusing on sharing some ideas with you. Tomorrow, there'll be another public meeting where you'll see a little bit more progress on what you'll see today and have another presentation and discussion. And then that really sets us up for a more robust stakeholder engagement throughout the summer. And then in this fall, we'll come into what we call the design workshop, which will be hopefully in person. We're not sure yet, but that's the intent. And that's when we'll be really coming up with the overall street design concept. We've received some really great feedback from you all and from other folks about things that they like along the corridor, what needs to be improved, and some thoughts around how to improve it. You know, so we've heard again there are some great iconic features within this community: the theaters, restaurant rows, the historic fabric. There are wide sidewalks already, or you have that opportunity, and there's maybe ways we can enhance those. Some aspects that people wanted to see created are the sense of pedestrian scale elements, some additional storefronts, and encouraging new development along there. Sidewalk dining and seating, maybe potentially some gateway treatments at key areas along the corridor. Some of the other comments that we heard, you know, again, improved transit experience throughout the corridor. You know, knowing Wilshire serves not only a local context, but also a regional role as well. And creating a sense of identity or a sense of place for Wilshire and La Cienega. So it has its own sense of identity within the community. And it's a place that people are encouraged to go. A lot of people mentioned different streets. We asked a question around destination streets. Where do you go? What do you like? And lots of people teased out a number of different locations. We couldn't pull it all together right now, but some just streets that seem to resonate with folks are those that are of a certain scale and experience. And there's ways we can, there's some strategies that we have for how we can bring a little bit of that, infuse a little bit of that into Wilshire and La Cienega. elements of a great street. So just wanted to, again, mention some things that we're considering based on some of the conversations. The importance of nodes and destinations along the corridor and breaking it down into maybe some areas where people can congregate, or there's a greater presence of sort of retail and commercial areas. That's a real critical component of this, and we'll talk about maybe how that breaks down in character zones in the next slide here. But some of the elements that we know you've talked about is how can we get these destinations and nodes to really contribute to the experience and provide opportunities for rest or congregation. Street character, is there some ways that we can infuse a sense of identity through not only the materials that we choose, but also the plantings and different elements there. Buildings and sidewalks, again, making these what we call human scale, so they feel very comfortable to people who are walking along the corridor. And there's lots of strategies we can employ to do that around creating new active and open facades as redevelopment happens, and ways to encourage cafe spill out space or retail spill out space in a new configuration. In terms of movement, we heard a lot about the importance of access to and across the corridors. Again, some mention of transit, and is that possible within this corridor? How are we incorporating that? And most importantly, I would say comfort and safety throughout the corridor and across it. Sounded from a lot of the stakeholder interviews as really paramount and something we need to focus on. So some of that plays out through different types of elements that we incorporate into a streetscape strategy. And those of you who were here last night will probably recognize this board. I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but just give you a sense of things that we're thinking about as strategies for Wilshire and Cienega. So sidewalk furnishings, what do those look like? The seating elements, how do they contribute? How do even the trash receptacles can be part of an identity? The landscape features and plantings as well. How do we enhance what's already there? We know there's already a cadence of palm trees along these corridors or ficus trees, but how do we incorporate a little bit more of that greenery into the area? And I should mention, in the studio space, we're going to be zooming around to different boards, so bear with me as I zoom from one to the other. Crossings, again, as we talked a lot to folks about the importance of pedestrian comfort and safety, how do we provide great opportunities to do that at key intersections? And that can be handled through different things like a pedestrian scramble. And then in some instances, there might be opportunities along the corridors to provide for mid-block pedestrian crossings and refuges, but how we treat those will be really, really important. So people are safe, feel safer, and are safer. Signage and wayfinding can be a great identity feature as well, or part of, as we think of it cohesively, and part of the strategy to really tell the identity of Beverly Hills. Some other elements that we talked about with folks are transit and the importance of creating shelters that feel welcoming and feel perhaps part of the identity as well of Beverly Hills and are contributing elements within the corridor. Lighting can also be a feature here. There's a lot of different types of lighting along the corridor, and what are some of the ways we can kind of pull that all together and have an overarching strategy for lighting that feels pedestrian scale and has contributes to the safety along the corridor as well. And hardscaping and pavement, are there ways we can sort of express the identity of the community in different ways through the materials that we're choosing? And this is just some examples of how that happens in different corridors. This one, I think, is a great example of a pretty narrow sidewalk in an area where they've clearly delineated the pavement in different ways, and it feels very comfortable. So just some, again, strategies that we're considering right now, and then we wanted to talk a little bit about the character zones that we're seeing along the corridor, what we want to set up for along the two corridors. And this graphic we would have seen last night if you were part of the conversation as well. 4 real distinct, I would say, character zones that we see along the corridor, and of course open this up for conversation as well when we get to that point. What are the key ones are that I want to call out along the corridor are the West Wilshire character zone and how that feels. It feels different around that the hotel that is there and the park space or the green space adjacent to it. And then there's a real feeling of potentially a gateway at Santa Monica and Wilshire already with the fountain there. It's sort of you feel like you're progressing into Beverly Hills. The Golden Triangle, of course, feels as its own character zone as well, and how we treat that, and maybe think about some strategies there as well. And then the Mid-Wilshire character zone feels a little different as well. Feels a little bit more like people are passing through the corridor. If there's not as many, I would say, key destinations that people are walking to. That's not to say that there couldn't be in the future, but something feels different at this point in time. And of course, Wilshire or La Cienega feels different as you pass through the park to the south and La Cienega Park there, and then also north to what has been historically referred to as Restaurant Row. So some ways we're just breaking down the corridor, and I think what this helps us with is thinking about streetscape strategies that make sense along the entire corridor and sort of stitches it together. But then as we think about interventions within these zones, how do they differ? And what is maybe the intensity of the landscaping in different areas, or the furnishings, or the different elements that we're incorporating into the streetscape? So just some ideas, again, that we're exploring in terms of the overall character of the corridor. And I'm going to pass it over to Kristen to talk a little bit about what we envision, this idea that Nat mentioned at the beginning, how people will navigate. What is a day in the life of a person, maybe a commuter, a resident, a tourist, or a visitor to the area, and just some flows around how they would navigate the corridor and maybe expend time within this area. So, Kristen, do you want to take control?
Yeah, go ahead. Thanks, Cindy. So I think one thing that we really like to do as designers is really focus on the user experience. And so to do that, we decided to pick these different types of people and kind of think about what kind of trips they might make, what kind of modes they would use, and what the experience would be for them. So these are our quick ideas. We tried to think of like how people who live there would use the area, people who are visitors. So we picked a commuter, and made up these little stories. Like commuter uses the metro to get to work, and then maybe he goes and meets his wife for dinner along Restaurant Row, and then we drew out his pathway. A resident might do some walking, might take the bus, go to different destinations in the area. The tourists, they hit all the tourist spots, but they have the opportunity to even use the metro for short distances between the Reeves and La Cienega station. And then a visitor, there's a lot of medical offices in the area, doctors and dentists, so people will be making those trips as well. Maybe someone stops and gets a cup of coffee, so they kind of make a circuit through the neighborhood. So you could see these lines kind of indicate the trips that people might take. And I think it's kind of fun. We just started populating the map with some of the destinations along the route. But by making the corridor more attractive, we are hoping that more people will be walking, more people will choose to walk and use the metro, especially people who live there.
Yeah, so you can see the green line indicates the residents who might take a longer trip. There might be more destinations along here that someone is wanting to explore or experience based on needs of services and goods. Tourists might be a little bit more located in this particular area, the Golden Triangle. The visitor also comes from Metro, might go get a cup of coffee, go down to Cedars-Sinai and the pharmacy, and that's the extent of their trip. And the commuter, yep, yeah, exactly, is maybe also coming out of the Metro here, going up to maybe their destination of where they work. Maybe it's at Cedars-Sinai, and they're maybe having some lunch or some dinner at another restaurant or destination, and then they return back to their home as well. So And then we wanted to dive into some, just, again, some starter ideas around how we can improve the sidewalk experience. And these are a series of vignettes that I'll have Clarence and Abby speak to create a more enjoyable sidewalk with the space that we have existing, and maybe some ways to augment that for the future. So Clarence and Abby, go ahead and take it away.
Great. I'll jump in just because going in order here. I'm Abby. I'm with Rios, who's also on the design team. So just to build off some of what Cindy and Nat and Kristen have already said, we've heard a lot of great feedback about trying to find ways to make the sidewalk a more enjoyable experience along Wilshire and La Cienega. So really focusing on the pedestrian experience and thinking about how we could make that, more enjoyable, more comfortable, safer, more beautiful, just better in general. So later we'll touch on, there might be ways in certain moments to actually expand the sidewalk zone, but here we wanted to just think about what are some strategies that we could do to work with the existing sidewalk. The majority of the sidewalks in the project area are 15 feet wide. So that's not an enormous sidewalk, but it's certainly enough space to carve out some different zones. So here you see two different diagrams of some strategies we could use to carve out different areas within the sidewalk to help make it feel like more of a place, enliven it, make it safer, and again, more enjoyable all around. So on the left, you'll see one where we thought about dividing the sidewalk into two general zones, one being a 10-foot area close to the building and one being a 5-foot zone closer to the street. In certain areas along the corridors, it might make sense to have sidewalk dining or let the retail spill out onto the sidewalk. So that's what you're seeing on the left here. And this can be great not only for folks coming to eat at the restaurant and want to sit at the patio, especially during post-COVID or current COVID times, but also makes the sidewalk more enjoyable and feel like more of a place, even if you're just walking by. And then on the right, you'll see a different strategy, which is creating a clear path of travel, that 5-foot zone close to the building, and then reserving a 10-foot width closer to the street that could be filled with landscape and furnishing and become a zone that works as a bit of a buffer, such that if you're walking on the sidewalk, you feel a sense of protection from the cars zooming by. But then also can be a space that's occupiable. So at certain moments, we might want to have seating mixed in with landscape like you see here. And those pictures on the right, I think, help give an example of what those zones can feel like. They can be distinguished by different paving, for example, so you actually see a difference. Other times you might not even need that. It's created by the plantings or the sidewalk furniture. And then the last thing I want to note is that these strategies will be super contextual. So they wouldn't make sense everywhere along the corridor. And when we get into the design phase, we would want to think very carefully about where it would make sense to divide the sidewalk into an area with sidewalk dining, where it would make sense to carve out areas for planting, etc. So they're not blanket treatments, but they're used strategically throughout the corridor.
Yeah,
great.
I was just going to lift up, Anne is already chatting in the chat box. And, with the amount of folks we have on this call, I think it's okay. Folks should be able to unmute themselves if they want to chime in. I'll just read Anne's comment. She says, "I'm sure I'm in the minority, but I have never enjoyed alfresco dining next to 6 lanes of car traffic," which is, a great point. And I think, this is one strategy that, to Abby's last point, we would want to contextually apply throughout the corridor. And throughout both corridors, right? La Cienega is going to look a lot different than Wilshire, given the geometry and the travel lanes. And so I think that's a great note, and we'll make a document of that note that, where we have sidewalk dinings, do we want to think about narrowing the street in targeted locations? That's definitely, something we hear, you know, this is the tension of the streetscape design process, right? We have all of these great ideas and only so much roadway width to you know, handle all of the different sort of priorities. So so yeah, thanks Anne for lifting that up, and you know, I think that is something for us to consider through these different like character zones that Cindy walked through. So yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nat. And I think we'll have another discussion around this and these ideas as we look at some cross sections that we've started to just frame conversation again with you. I'll pass it off to Clarence now to talk a little bit more about some green landscaping opportunities and then also some street furnishing opportunities.
I'm Clarence. I'm also with Rios. I'm part of the design team. And one of the comments that we heard is the want and the desire for more green on the street, whether that's through ground planting or through the addition of canopy trees. Right now, the existing palm trees are kind of at a rhythm that's between 70 and 100 feet on a lot of these blocks. We understand that these palm trees are very iconic, but they do not provide sort of a pedestrian scale, both in its rhythm or its height. They also do not provide a lot of pedestrian shade. So one thought is a strategy where we begin to punctuate in between those palm trees with a canopy tree, something that's a little bit more scaled to the pedestrian, and providing some ground planting within those canopy tree zones that could provide not just a green kind of wash across the street, but also has the function of becoming a barrier and a buffer so that people will feel safer, whether it is through some sort of pedestrian amenity zone, through dining, or as you are walking down the street. And then if we wanted to go to furnishing next, we wanted to have a conversation about what are the different amenities that happen on this pedestrian scaled streetscape, and how we can begin to concentrate furnishing at certain nodes, certain areas where we feel like there will be more pedestrian activity, but then also have a consistency of both furnishings, then also rhythm of street lighting or street furnishings along the entire corridor. We wanted to kind of open up the discussion about not just what the furnishings are, but also what these bus shelters begin to be, and how all of these furnishings add to the identity of the corridor.
Great, thanks, Clarence. And I'll also mention that, you know, some of these strategies are what we would say, you know, kind of long-term ideas. I know we talked with Ken, urban forester, around, you know, as we think about augmenting the corridor, what does that mean in terms of maintenance and things like that? So it's something we need to consider, and there are some lighter touch interventions that we can have, say in this green landscaping approach that maybe are above ground, or when the street can be reconstructed, really being intentional about incorporating irrigation and opportunities to take care and maintain the plants if that's something that moves forward. So I think I saw another chat come through. Should we pause for that?
Yeah, it's from Mandana. The 5-foot pedestrian path next to street may have issues with tree placements and will not feel so safe. You know, I think that's definitely true. If there's, again, those 6 lanes of vehicle traffic, 7 lanes of vehicle traffic, including the center turn lane, you know, and on Wilshire specifically. And so, you know, I think it's a great note that, like, again, balancing all of these strategies with the context of the corridor is going to be super critical, and, you know, and engaging in some difficult conversations around trade-offs of roadway space. And I think that's, you know, what Cindy is going to preview next with some of these cross sections. So, you know, keep those comments coming. You know, I think this is exactly what we want, you know, to hear from folks. And, you know, I think we're also eager to engage in a dialogue and a discussion. So if you want to verbalize something, you know, please, if for whatever reason you're not able to unmute yourself, let us know, and we should be able to take care of that for you, so that we can talk and have a dialogue. I think that's part of the richness of this conversation, is we want to, you know, to really hear from folks in the room.
Great, thanks, Nat. Yeah, and I think this will be the point where we'll get a real rich conversation, because this is teeing up some different ideas on what we know about the corridor, what are some strategies or ways we can repurpose some of the lanes, and if that's tenable. And so it's going to be, I think, hopefully a good conversation here. So just want to, it's always great to tee it up with what's existing right now. So you all know how it operates for the most part. 3 lanes in each direction with left turn, protected left turn lanes at number of the intersections. And again, 15-foot sidewalks pretty much throughout the corridor, with a few exceptions. When I say corridor, I mean both La Cienega and Wilshire, but we're focusing mostly on Wilshire right now.
Yeah, right. This is the cross section for Wilshire specifically, right?
Yeah. Yep. For Wilshire and specifically. One idea, we heard a lot about the transit that runs through, not only serves the community, but runs through it as well. And the option of continuing some of those bus priority lanes through here. And that would be repurposing the outdoor to bus-only travel. Again, this is one way, if you do have bus priority on that edge, it allows for better headways or better timing of that system. The delay for transit is improved when they're not operating or kind of leapfrogging through personal vehicles as well. This is also a nice strategy. It does help the edge of the streets feel a little bit more comfortable. You don't have often buses obey the posted speed limits for the most part, and it's more comfortable in terms of the speed along adjacent to a sidewalk. And also there's the importance of how we treat that. As Abby was talking about, in some areas, the walkway is along the building edge, and how we treat that 5 feet right adjacent to the busway is really critical as well. So thinking through strategies around that in terms of landscaping and furnishings to make it feel safe and comfortable.
Yeah, and I'll just note on this one, again, for some of the comments that were already made about not enjoying alfresco dining next to 6 lanes of car traffic or the 5-foot pedestrian path, this is one strategy to think about how that curb lane can be just a different type of buffer. And I'll just also note that, we've heard and we know, through our stakeholder interviews, we know that there's a history of an attempt to put a bus lane down Wilshire previously in Beverly Hills, and that's come up in these meetings before. So we're not glossing over that. This is just part of our responsibility as designers to consider all sort of options and all different ways of thinking about how to future-proof the street, how to think about what the street will look like, not just in the current condition, but 2, 5, 10 years down the line. So just wanted to make sure that folks know we're aware of the history, and we're also sort of thinking about the future. And the last thing I'll say also is actually, in the design team, we haven't talked about this, but there are sort of more targeted bus improvements that you can make as opposed to just a bus lane, queue jump lanes, things that allow you to speed up, bus activity just in sort of targeted improvements around intersections. So that's something to think about in our design approach as well.
Yeah, thanks, Nat. And I think one thing I want to call out here is probably a pretty critical element that we didn't focus on too much for this initial pinup, but is this idea of a median. And this is something I think that would be a great strategy for, especially along Wilshire, as we think about if we can't really affect the sidewalk space on the outside edges. What are some other ways we can make the street sort of have its own sense of identity and iconic feeling? And in some areas we have left turn lanes, dedicated left turn lanes, but they're sometimes very long turning pockets, and we could shorten those, meaning the length of this lane right here is very long. But there are opportunities where we can shorten that up, still provide for the dedicated left turn lane, but create a median experience. And I have some images that we can look at if you're interested from some comparable cities that have done a really good job with medians. And you already have some, of course, in some areas along Wilshire, certainly along in the Golden Triangle area, but there's we could supplement that with some others as well. Another option for that outside turn lane and to incorporate a little bit more pedestrian-friendly environment is to repurpose that outside lane as parking, dedicated parking with bump outs. This would allow for, again, landscaping throughout the corridor a little bit more, and again, that buffer, that real feeling of a buffer between the fast or the heavy motor vehicle in the two interior travel lanes, and of course the dedicated left turn lane. So just another option that we're exploring. I might pause here and see if there's any comments on these two options and how people feel. I'd love to hear from folks. Feel free to unmute yourself again or chat us if that's easiest.
Hey guys, this is Corey Clem. I just wanted to agree with Ann. I don't think we could do a greater disservice to this corridor than like not be able to provide a contiguous infrastructure from what borders us to the east and the west. I know there's a history there, but hopefully we can pitch to the community and help them understand that even though that there's a rail line going underneath us, that the buses serve a lot of other people. And as we start to get some increased density, that's gonna be very important for people to come in for work across all jobs. And I think that the pushback that I've heard on this is they think the subway is going to solve that problem. And I just want to make sure that as you guys pitch this to the public, that you help make that distinction.
Great point. You know, sort of that local service is really critical. Metro serves a certain role, as does transit within this area.
Yeah, and you know that I was just going to say that you know, we could even think about a reframing of the name bus priority, right? Because we've seen other cities, you know, take these sort of flexible lanes and turn them into, you know, just different mode lanes. So like taxi lanes, TNC lanes. You know, we've seen you know, other private shuttles. You know, we've heard from some of the other institutions in the area their interest in providing some more like mass transit. And so it's just about sort of thinking about the flexibility of the street and the flexibility of its needs, or the dynamics of the street, I should say, and how we can create a street that's a little bit more catering to all those different needs. So thanks Anne, who typed it into chat, and Corey for speaking up. It's helpful to hear that.
I don't know if it's a third rail, but I had mentioned in my chat with you guys about, you know, if you look at the data from bike share to our accident data to just Strava, I mean, this is going to get used by cyclists who are taking other forms, including the subways. I don't know if you've got a transit priority slide where that becomes a hybrid, and maybe you left that off intentionally, but I don't know, maybe that's a harder thing to sell, but I just think that outside lane as transit's a really good way to pitch it.
Yeah, that's a great comment. We do have some imagery around, yeah, here we go, you know, that repurposing or that dual purpose option.
Yeah, I saw that. That's great. And obviously that flanks us to the east and the west. So, you know, people aren't gonna, they're probably the people that are commuting that are not on the charrette right now. And when they get to the city borders aren't gonna understand that that's gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. Any other comments? I'd love to hear from others on these two different options and ideas along Wilshire.
Anne, I'm curious if you'd be willing to unmute yourself and just elaborate a little bit more on some of what you've dropped into the chat.
Oh, hi there. I don't want to dominate the discussion.
No, but I'd love, you know, it's helpful to just hear some of the context that you're thinking about. You know, you mentioned, you know, interested in a bus lane, but, you know, you're also not interested in alfresco dining. So, you know, next to like busy traffic. So yeah, just would be curious to elaborate on that a little bit more.
I think the number one solution, and Beverly Hills does it so well, is trees. And I think there really should be that median in the middle. You've got it on La Cienega, south of Wilshire, between Gregory and Olympic. And, you know, I think, well, the cars are so fast there, but I do think it does probably help calm the traffic. Mm-hmm. And if we can get trees with some decent canopies, you know, it'll help clear our air and And I just think it's the best tool to make walking hospitable and car life bearable. So you can't do enough in terms of tree canopy and planting. And it's, you know, it's a good deal too, I guess, right? But I think there's I think that, well, since I'm talking, I think it's also Wilshire is a contiguous street heading east. And like the other man from the Historical Society the other day mentioned, connecting the La Cienega stop as far as the Academy Museum at Fairfax. We're two cities, but could we, I live in Carthay Circle, just on the edge of Beverly Hills. And there's that San Vicente Wilshire intersection, which is enormous, and it has those angles. And and I don't know where where Beverly Hills ends, but I'm hoping that, I'll just put a plug in, that both cities can somehow work together on that so that everybody can get across that intersection and make it more functional along the street. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Anne.
Yeah, I mean, the median, just to riff off that for a second, and I think Cindy already mentioned this, but the planted median helps the street feel like two streets in one, you know, so it's not this huge wide, you know, a harsh environment if we were going to find areas for outdoor dining or seating. Yeah, so that's definitely something that we're thinking about. Yeah, there's a great example of it.
Yeah, I think there's some ways to incorporate, like you said, some deciduous canopy trees within here. This is an example in Florida, but I think it's really a valuable one, I think, to think about in terms of breaking down that sort of mid-block area, like I mentioned, between the turning lanes. Any other comments on Wilshire and the two different options we've shown here? If not, I'm gonna head down to our thoughts on La Cienega.
Can I just ask one quick question? I'm sorry, it has nothing to do with that lane, but these are beautiful designs. Everybody always is concerned about traffic, no matter what modality you're in. Do you guys ever back these up with data, with the data that you currently have and the anticipated density and traffic that's coming from this, to show during peak times maybe what that looks like, even if it's a beautiful little visualization and a model? Do you ever use that?
Yeah, I would. That's a great question, Corey. I would say that's one thing that our firm is really focused on, is making sure this still functions and being able to tell the story. And when I say functions, I mean it's functioning for all nodes, but then also being able to back it up, the strategies, the changes to lane configurations with data. And so we've requested that from the city, and we're going to be looking at that a little bit closer. I think for what we know in terms of the ADT, or the annual daily travel, we can certainly accommodate what's happening with the lanes that we're proposing here. But doing a little bit more review of that, I think, is our due diligence that will happen in the next couple of days and following the Charrette.
That'd be awesome. I know you guys are good at it. I'd love to see it. I know the residents would too.
Yeah, and I'll just offer, one other thing that we also do in that sense is make sure we can ground truth it with similar examples of other, streets with the same capacity, the same sort of ADT, the same number of trips, and the different configurations that we're looking at. And you actually don't have to go that far. If you just go, a couple more miles to the west, Wilshire Boulevard in Santa Monica has two lanes in each direction. A transit-only lane during peak periods, and the rest of it is parking, and they have about 45,000, 50,000 average daily trips as well. But yeah, I think we would want to be looking at the data for this street, in particular the traffic counts in Beverly Hills, and make sure we're making some informed design decisions based on that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Corey. Appreciate it. The existing conditions along La Cienega are not dissimilar to what you see on Wilshire. A little bit different buildings and sort of form, their architectural form. But again, a cross section that you're probably well familiar with in terms of 3 travel lanes in each direction, left turning movement protected, and then 15-foot sidewalks. Similar sort of approach here. One of the things we think is we've heard a lot about is this historical role that this street or this land use has played in terms of restaurant row, and is that something we want to continue to encourage or bring back, really, and how can we do that through some different streetscape strategies. So again, how we're thinking about that buffer space. In this instance, we're showing, again, a protected sidewalk with parking, and then some bump outs in certain areas. If it makes sense based on land use and encouragement, if there's adjacent parking, this whole space, including that 8 feet, can also become part of the sidewalk, and then that's a very generous space for potentially outdoor seating and cafe spill-out space, retail spill-out space as well. So that's the parallel parking option along there. Again, median could be incorporated into any of these that you're seeing. This one is another wider sidewalk, I guess exactly what I was just mentioning, where we could have, again, a median treatment in the middle, still allow for two lanes of travel, and then a narrower parking bay along with generous sidewalk increased sidewalk and some planting areas there too. So I will pause here and keep these 2 slides up and for any comments or questions people have. Anything anyone wants to add from the design team as well? I would open it up to you and to other folks.
Yeah, I would just offer, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Nat, sorry.
I was just going to offer one of the things on La Cienega that we're also looking at is, in addition to the cross section, looking at the rhythm of crossing opportunities throughout the stretch that's in the city of Beverly Hills, because there aren't many at all, and so those are really long blocks, and whether it's the treatment on the right wider with a median, or the treatment on the left, just finding opportunities to knit together the 2 sides, so that it feels like one cohesive place, and not that there's this huge barrier to get from one side to the other currently if you're on foot, if you're just trying to get out for dinner or whatnot. So that's something that we're that's a great note to illustrate some mid-block crossing opportunities in these and again, like, you're watching the design process happen right now. We've got another day at this, where we'll be closing things out tomorrow. So all these comments are really, helpful, productive comments as part of the process.
Now, could I just add one question?
Please.
Yeah. So with only a single portal, it kind of has a tendency, and I know there's the possibility of a mobility hub on the other side with the staging yard. There's, we're 10 years away from West Hollywood getting any kind of subway at a minimum, and there's a lot of density up there. If you go all the way up to Beverly, I think is the 1 mile radius, but you're going to have a lot of people using the station. Do you have any plan for people to navigate La Cienega north at all, on any other modalities? I know that you guys aren't in the business of putting new MTA buses, metro buses on the side of these things, but how do people on shared mobility and scooters and bikes move north or south?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We are, tasked with looking at a first last mile study around the station area, which will include, how people on bike, how people on other, sort of modality options access that station area. We're guided by the planning documents that we have, right? And so for the city of Beverly Hills, La Cienega is not on the bike plan. And so, what we'll want to look at is those side streets that are identified as, more all ages and abilities type of cycling. And then, making sure that in our recommendations, there's adequate, wayfinding, adequate opportunities for people to understand, if you're on a bike, here's how you could access areas to the north or to the south. If you're on foot, we had somebody in one of our conversations bring up, they really liked the wayfinding items that tell you how many minutes things are away on foot as opposed to how many miles things are away on foot. So, those are the types of of design considerations that will be taken into account for this planning process as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Nat, for fielding that question. On that note, did you want to mention a little bit about the mobility hub, Nat, and what we're doing around that?
Yeah, sure. So, so we are, as part of this project, also looking at the Yale staging yard right now that Metro is using, which is about a block and a half to the east of the north portal on the north east corner of Wilshire and La Cienega. And, you know, we're really tasked with thinking about all the different sort of programming elements for what a quote unquote mobility hub would look like. And just yesterday, you know, we had a conversation internally about, you know, there are many different ways to think about the design and programming of a mobility hub and what type of mobility, what are the amenities, you know, there's this balance between the sort of operational transportation needs, you know, bike storage, you know, TNC, pick up and drop off, to then the sort of place-based elements, the sort of the, you know, what you might call sort of land use or like amenity programming, food halls, restrooms, you know, the ability to get a coffee. And so, you know, we're tasked with thinking through the different ways to go about both programming that from a transportation standpoint. And again, some of these same conversations are really important to thinking about pick up and drop off on the curb area or on the side streets, and how do we make sure we design a transportation environment that doesn't adequately accommodates all the different ways people are going to access the station. One of the big concerns is, you know, not having people driving, blocking, you know, Wilshire and La Cienega at that corner portal area. And so that's why this mobility hub is an important thing from a transportation perspective, and thinking about how we tie people from that Yale staging yard to the portal itself. And, you know, then we also have to think about land use and amenity programming and, you know, how to really make it a place. So it's, we're operating at the intersection of transportation and land use, much like the Streetscape plan. And that is, you know, part of our work over the summer months and, you know, ongoing community engagement is going to be continuing to sort of throw the ideas against the wall for what makes sense, what are the community priorities for that mobility hub. So if anybody here has thoughts, you know, Corey would love to hear some of the things that you're thinking about. Anybody else, again, would love to start that dialogue about mobility hub, mobility options for accessing the Wilshire and La Cienega station in particular.
Well, I guess this didn't come out in our conversations yet. This is Corey again, sorry. But this didn't come out in our conversations yesterday, but I guess I always assumed that the eastern edge of the city might be a little more forgiving to access, especially when you got employers like the Beverly Center, 11,000 people at Cedars. I mean, but there's no contiguous infrastructure there, even with wayfinding. So I guess I'm curious, I've got a map right now of a 1 mile radius of that stop. How do the employees of Cedars get up there? You know, if you're not treating that here or through the mobility hub, kicking them off to on the west side of the street, a bi-directional bikeway, you know, that takes you up to that crazy intersection at Burton Way and La Cienega, which is not without its challenges.
Yeah, great ideas, great things for us to be thinking about in the design process. I know we had a conversation with Cedars, and they're certainly starting to think about how they're shuttling employees to and from the subway station, and again, our first last mile study, you know, will be really important to think about all the different ways people are going to access that station.
So that still might influence this design, or no?
Yes, yes, that's part of our scope, so that will influence this design.
So I will just kind of zoom back out just to give you get a sense of, again, what we just talked about. If there's anything you want us to zoom back into or want to talk about, I want to offer that up. We can look at any of the boards, again, we presented today, what we've been working on in terms of a little bit more deeper dive into the streetscape elements, cross sections, anything you'd like to talk about. Typically we'd say go to a different table, but here we are all together at one table. So mention anything you want. I'll pause now.
Yeah.
I mean, I come from software. We do user stories for all of our stuff. It might be nice to see some user stories for the La Cienega hub, since you just have them for the triangle right now, I think.
Thanks, that's a great comment.
The reason I dwell on that so much is, and I don't know how much you guys get into the planning process, but from everything I've heard from Dr. Gold, there's a lot of energy around developing that area with more density. So to not treat that like I've seen every other subway stop in the world scares the hell out of me, because anybody east of us is going to basically run into that wall, and they're going to have to go into the triangle to get out, assuming we have the infrastructure there. So I take that into consideration, that could tend to be the densest part of our city by the time this is done.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, and I think that tracks with what we were showing in the like character zones, right? Like I think really thinking about the design priority for Wilshire and La Cienega as, the pedestrian as the design vehicle, right? Like I'll come back to that again and again. Like, yeah, what you see in hot pink there, like that has to feel like a different type of place, when the subway is open. And, we know that, we know, again, we've heard it many times, Wilshire is regional corridor, people traveling through, right? And that doesn't mean, especially if we want it to feel uniquely Beverly Hills, when people come up from that subway station, like the way in which we treat the public realm, decorative crosswalks, curb extensions, public plazas. These are all really important things to be thinking about to ensure that when you're in that zone, it's clear, you're here in Beverly Hills. So who else? Really, this is your time. We're here for you all. We want to answer questions, want to engage in a dialogue. So would invite anybody else on the call to unmute themselves, speak up, ask us questions, and I'm happy to call on some folks. Elisa, Anne, if you want to speak again. Nicole, would love to hear from you. If you have specific things that you want to get into. We've got another day of design in this charrette process. So, we're going to be, taking everything that we learned today and, compiling it into a sort of final report out at the end of the day tomorrow. So, so all of this, you're part of our team in live time. So anything you can share, any questions you can ask are really going to help make this a more robust process. And I know at the top, we said at the top of this meeting at 3 o'clock, we said we'd give another, sort of intro, share what we're working on from 4 to 5. So, I'm curious, anybody on the call, if there's anybody participating right now, if there's anything you missed at the beginning that you want us to go back to, drop it into the chat. I'm happy to repeat, what I said at the top about the charrette process, and start to go through it again. Certainly don't want it to be overly repetitive for folks. So, again, if there's specific design concepts, specific things that you want us to drill down into, please chime in. I know Darren's got some ideas.
I know Ken does too, Ken Pfaltzgraf.
I'll just speak for myself. I do have ideas, but I'm really here just to hear what the residents and the businesses of the community.
Of course. I know. I was teasing. Ken, you wanna offer anything?
Yeah, that's you heard Darren. That's why he's my boss. Expert tutelage.
Awesome. Well, Ken, I appreciate seeing your video and all the musical instruments you have behind you. That's I think we're gonna have to factor that into our next charrette somehow.
Yeah, right.
Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Oh, I'm a consultant right now, so I'll be paid for this.
Yeah.
You see the palm tree?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So, yeah, those, I make those. So we're really, really bored now, I can tell.
Awesome. Well, I think you gave some great feedback to us as a design team to, around landscape and being practical, and also ways to infuse a little bit more of like the tree canopy idea. So I appreciated the conversation that we had yesterday and how to really think about that from a kind of maybe short-term perspective, but then also long-term, like you said, make sure, it may not be something we can do right now, but is there ways we can think about how we plumb the area for irrigation and turn-offs that are appropriate and things like that. So anything you have to offer and tell the whole group around your perspective on landscape, I'm more than open to hearing you.
I do like the idea that when you open up the meeting, one of the elephants in the room is you see staff deals with often intimately. You find in most governmental agencies, you have layers and buffers, so it might take you 2 months to finally get to the director. You'll find in our agency that you are available right now, and the more you are, the better. Also, though, you'll find that we're not structured to be, we're structured to give as much equity as we can in service, and so we don't just take care of everyone while taking care of no one, if you know what I mean. So our service models are set up like in trees. We get on streets, we get off streets. We're not there to come to parties and be friends. We know our place in the city, but you do have one of the elephants in the room where people are coming into the meeting from the public and saying, we didn't want this, we don't want it here. And that presents kind of a wall to you guys. I am happy to see that you're working past that, because I do believe that no one's going to magically stop this from happening. And the day is coming where all of a sudden it is there. And if you've done nothing to plan, that's going to be really bad. But if you're taking the input of people, I think the message I'm hearing is we don't want people hanging out there. We want to help them get where they're going. And do that effectively with as minimal impact on, because we have a very small city. When you look at it, it's pretty easy to get in residential neighborhoods fairly quickly. So I am glad that you brought up, it was necessary to have a meeting and discussion about crime and stuff, but I do see that police and fire are engaged in this process, so that's a good sign. So yeah, there's my 5 minutes.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, so I have seen a few additional folks join. I think it is 4 o'clock, so I'm just going to give the same sort of presentation that I gave at the top at 3 o'clock. So I just wanted to again thank everybody for being here. For those of you who don't know me yet, I'm Nat Gale, the project manager for this project. I'm a planner and an engineer in tool design. And this is our open studio session for this discovery charrette. So if we were in person, this is where we would throw open our doors and have everybody come into the room and see us in the midst of a design process. I mentioned you'd see all of our coffee cups on the tables, all of our sketch pads, and trace paper and rulers. And so, we're obviously not in person, and that offers us the ability to, sort of show in a digital space some of the design concepts, design ideas. And for those of you who have been on, we have, been taking notes on Post-it notes on the design concepts that we've talked through, and really want to continue to have a rich conversation about, different ideas, different concepts. I'll say that this is, we're at the very beginning of our design process. This is about discovering different concepts that work, different ideas, different thought processes, different like comparisons and examples that we should be building off of. So, nothing about what we're showing today, nothing about what we're doing is recommendations. It's the start of a conversation. Everything that we're doing is trying to explore what works, what's feasible, where are some red flags or blind spots that maybe we haven't thought about. And so, really want to walk through, some of the things that we've heard, some of the things that we've learned, and how we're then, from what we've heard and learned, we're trying to think through design solutions, design ideas, design thinking. Now, I mentioned at the top, we've heard some comments about how this project might invite unwelcome issues into Beverly Hills, like crime, and you heard, Ken sort of address some of that. And, happy to address that head on. What we know as urban designers is that high quality urban design creates welcome, safe spaces that cater to a variety of needs. And that's the direction of our design process. Later, in the presentation, for folks who weren't here in the first hour, we'll talk through, some preliminary ideas we've had around user journeys to understand the variety of use cases that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about design and use on Wilshire Boulevard and La Cienega Boulevard. That being said, if anybody's interested in having a breakout conversation on this topic, on the topic of adverse issues in Beverly Hills, I'm happy to host a small session so that we can dig a little bit deeper. I'm the project manager. It's my job to make sure that everybody's voice is heard, and so I want to make sure that we provide that space and ability for folks to dig into those types of issues. So with that, Cindy, I don't know if there's anything else you want to start to cover on the design process in terms of what we've been up to.
Yeah, no, I might just, for those of you who were here from the 3 o'clock from the 3 o'clock hour, it's been a long week. I feel free to jump off. We're going to go through sort of the same thing. You're more than welcome to stay though and hear this again, and then also provide additional comments as we go through the process. But I want to again zoom out and just show you, this is what you would usually walk into, is a room of us just designing, and all of the different thoughts up on the wall and things we've been through in terms of ideas and different types of streetscape elements that we've been talking about based on, again, feedback. And like Nat said, I just want to reiterate, these are starter ideas. This is where the conversation has really influenced our exploration in terms of different elements that you'll see. And so, we've heard from a lot of people about the importance of making great streets for the community, for Beverly Hills, and that can play out in Wilshire and La Cienega as a study area. And how we do that will happen through a couple of different interventions, of course, how we're considering nodes and destinations, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of those within the corridor that we see and we know are important kind of gateways or areas, intersections of the community. Buildings and sidewalks, how they're activated in different ways and how they feel in terms of a human scale from their frontages and from their elements that we incorporate into them. Same with the overall street character. How are we addressing that it really is contributing to the experience of Beverly Hills and its identity. And that can happen through a variety of treatments. Again, everything from the furnishings that we use to the landscaping that you see to sort of median ideas throughout the corridor. And a lot of our conversations throughout the week have been around comfort and safety and movement throughout the corridor. There are certain areas of the corridor that feel like destinations, and there are certain areas where people may want to walk further distances, but it's not comfortable, it's not pleasant. And then there's of course the across element. So as we cross Wilshire or as we want to cross La Cienega, what are those opportunities and how do they feel? So those have been sort of what we've heard from a lot of different people, and how we've then are working toward translating that into design ideas. And I won't dwell too much on this, but as I've mentioned, there are different elements that we want to pull into the corridor when it comes to the different types of things that we can incorporate into the streetscape. And that's everything from furnishings and landscape, which we'll dive deeper into in a minute, to how we're treating crossings, how we're creating wayfinding that is, as Nat mentioned earlier, really human-centered. So it's about a walking time versus the distance. There are elements that we can think about there. How are we incorporating transit or exploring opportunities for that, as we know it serves a regional function and a local function when it comes to transporting people through the area. Hardscape is another element that we can treat or think of or consider in terms of it expressing an identity for the corridors as well. So again, how we maybe think about the different zones of the sidewalk and how those are treated, which we have some examples of ways we can break down that space as well. Pedestrian scale lighting, we heard a lot about safety and comfort, and that happens in the evenings as well, and how we're creating pedestrian scale lighting that again has a good feeling along the corridor for pedestrians as you're walking through. It's really important. We dove into some ideas around character zones. So this is a way of breaking down the corridor and how it sort of feels, or what is its current character, and what do we want to maybe enhance, and how do we then think about different treatments. So this graphic depicts 4 real zones for the overall Wilshire corridor, and then, well, more than 4 zones, and then also the La Cienega as well. So from the west, we really see that zone west of Santa Monica feeling a little different in character because of how its land uses are different on different sides. Of course, Santa Monica and Wilshire can provide a gateway, kind of a transition point into Beverly Hills here as well. And with the fountain there, kind of serves as its gateway into the Golden Triangle character zone. It's a bit different. It's character. There's some areas that feel much more pedestrian scale because of maybe median treatments or how sidewalks are treated. Again, what's interesting about that, though, is that the sidewalks are 15 feet, just like in other areas of this corridor. So that tells us, it's through the treatments that are there and what you experience there that makes it feel a little bit different. Mid-Wilshire really feels, again, same sort of sidewalk space, but feels a little bit different. Because of how the buildings are maybe facing or not facing their frontages on Wilshire. And some ways we want to consider how we can still make that maybe more pedestrian, how we can make that more pedestrian friendly. It's not necessarily that people are going to walk the entirety of this entire corridor, but when they do, that there's a comfortable feeling no matter how long their journey. North La Cienega, we've heard that referred to as Restaurant Row, and how we're incorporating potentially new ideas and strategies to enliven that area as it once was. Again, maybe it's a return to both more restaurants that are facing the street. Maybe there's some other retail that we can encourage there as well. South La Cienega really feels, again, like a different zone in the way it's treated, and also, of course, because of the park in that area. So there might be some different interventions. I think what we want to do is consider this cohesively. So the whole corridors work together, but there might be some different types of treatments as we think about the gateways or the pedestrian zones, and then along the corridor as well. And one way to sort of tease that out or think about it in terms of people who might make walking trips is to get at how people will get around Beverly Hills. And so we did a series of diagrams that Kristen's going to speak to here about how people might navigate the corridor as you come to Beverly Hills, or as a resident, of course, of the area. So Kristen, you want to take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. I am with Tool Design, a colleague of Nat and Cindy's. And so one of the things that we like to do is really focus on the user experience. And Cindy talked a lot about the elements that make a great streetscape, but thinking about how people will move around the corridor, whether it's on foot, the subway, by bus, a mix of different modes is a really helpful way for us to understand how the different zones work together and how we need to apply those elements. So what we did was kind of brainstorm about who would be some typical users. So we thought about a commuter who lives in the neighborhood, who uses the subway. We thought about a resident who does walking, who walks in the neighborhood. Tourists are an obvious user group. And then visitors. We know that there are a lot of medical and dental facilities here, so people will come to this corridor to do those kinds of things. So you can see, if you zoom out a little bit, on the far right, you can see the commuter. He might come from his home and walk to the metro station and get to work that way. And then in the evening, he comes back and he might walk up to Restaurant Row and meet his wife for dinner. So that's one option for how people might use the corridor. The green line indicates someone who might live south of Wilshire. Say her car is at the mechanics, and she decides she's going to take the bus to the pharmacy. So she gets on the bus on Wilshire and goes east, goes up to the pharmacy, and then she walks the rest of the way to meet a friend at the park. So that's a nice long trip, but the corridor end to end is about 2.5 miles. So breaking it up with different modes, it is pretty doable. The tourists are shown in that that network of orange lines. They're maybe staying at one of those hotels on Wilshire. They go and do a little circuit around Rodeo Drive. They could even get on the metro and go from one stop to the next, and then go up to Restaurant Row and have dinner, and then walk down to the Saban Theater for a show. So that's all a doable trip too. And then the visitor comes from the metro. Maybe they are going to see the doctor. They could go walk down to the pharmacy or walk across the street from Cedars-Sinai to the pharmacy, and then come back and grab a coffee before getting on the metro again. So everybody is going to move through this neighborhood in different ways, and the elements that we bring, that we can bring to the streetscape to make their experience better can be informed by thinking about how these trips are made.
Great, thanks, Kristen. And now we'll dive into some different ideas or different strategies and how we can think about, as we break it down or we look closer at sidewalks, what are some elements or interventions we can do to make a more cohesive streetscape. So Abby, if you would be so willing to talk about sort of the sidewalk zones.
Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Abby. I'm with Rios. We're an interdisciplinary design firm that's part of the team here. So just to build off of some of the comments you already heard from Nat and Cindy and Kristen, we've been hearing a lot about how making the sidewalks a more enjoyable place to be and to walk through should be a priority for this project. So making sidewalks better can mean a lot of different things. It might mean more enjoyable, safer, more comfortable, more beautiful, more lively. But we've been trying to think through some different strategies that we might use to improve the existing sidewalks. Later in the presentation, we'll talk about ways in which we might actually get to expand the sidewalk in a few zones. But here we're just thinking about what's already in place, which is typically a 15-foot sidewalk through almost all of our project area. So that's large enough that we can start thinking about creating some different zones within the sidewalk to help support different uses and also just make it a more enjoyable place as a pedestrian. So on the left, you'll see we were exploring the idea of a 10-foot zone close to the building edge that might be used for sidewalk dining. So this would make sense at key spots along the corridors where there are restaurants or maybe some other kind of retail that might want to spill out onto the sidewalk, and then maintaining a clear path of travel, in this case on the outside near the street. Noting, of course, that we'd always want to maintain enough width for a pedestrian or someone in a wheelchair to navigate around tree wells as well. And then on the right, another simple diagram looking at the composition flipped, basically. So you would have a clear 5-foot path of travel against the building edge, and then a 10-foot zone filled with plantings or maybe even furnishing like benches or seating close to the street. So in this case, you're creating a sense of a buffer or a sort of protection between someone walking and the lanes of traffic going by on the street. And you're also just making the area feel greener. There's an opportunity for green infrastructure and, as I mentioned, other amenities like lighting or seating or signage. And on those pictures on the right, you'll see some examples of how these zones have been installed in other cities. Sometimes using paving to call them out, and other times just creating the sense of different zones through the plantings and the furnishings. And you know, this comment applies to almost all of these strategies, but we would definitely want to think of these as very context-specific solutions. So these would not make sense everywhere in the corridor, and we would be really strategic about where it makes sense to have a moment with sidewalk dining versus where it makes sense to have moments with planting along the street edge.
Great, thanks, Abby. And Clarence, do you want to speak to some of the landscaping and street furnishings?
Yes. So one other thing that we heard is the desire for more green, both through planting and then also through trees along the corridor. As Abby pointed out, some of these strategies are a little bit more appropriate at certain spots along the corridor. So having a ground planting strip underneath some of these canopy trees that begin to punctuate in between the existing palm trees, create a pedestrian scale, but then also create a little bit of a buffer for pedestrians and then also some of those amenity uses from the street. Right now, the palms are spaced between 75 and 100 feet on center along Wilshire, and using these smaller canopy trees in between not only bring the height scale, but then also the rhythm of these trees, the scale down to the pedestrian. When we talk about some of these ground plantings, it's something that would occur mainly underneath the canopy trees and would be something that could be above ground or in ground, just based on the types of interventions that we would like to do on the street. And when we start to talk about some of the sidewalk furnishings, we want to talk about how some of these groupings would define nodes at certain areas along the corridor, how we begin to establish a rhythm along the more through parts of the corridor, but then how things such as bus shelters or cafe seating can also begin to express the character or begin to have some sort of identity for the entire corridor.
Great, thanks, thanks, Clarence and Abby and Kristen. And I might pause here for any comments that people want to make. I know there maybe have been some chats that come in. Nat, do you want to facilitate any of that, or should I keep moving on?
No, sure. Yeah, I know that Mitra has her hand up. So Mitra, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you very much. The thing is, I don't want to say something that is not a right place for it right now, because I could not, unfortunately, be here at 3 p.m. I regret that. So I want to talk about a subject of benches, homeless issue. Still, I'm at the intersection of La Cienega, Hamilton, Yale. I'm in that area right now because, as you know, we are very close to commercial zone, but this is a large residential zone. So I was about to talk about that, but I don't want to say something that it is not the right time or right place. So at this point, you lead. I don't know what to do.
Yeah. So I wonder, Cindy, do you have breakout room function on your Zoom?
On mine,
If you hover over the black bar at the bottom.
Yeah, at the top I can. I don't think breakout rooms. I do. Here we go.
So if you can put me and Mitra in a breakout room, I'd love to have it.
Thank you. Yes, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to assign manually to one room.
Yep.
Create a room, and I'm going to add. Can you see my screen? Sorry, options.
I don't see your option.
Yeah, no, you got this, Cindy.
Do you, so add a room, and then I need to assign. Oh, here we go. I see it. Thank you very much. Search for. I know I can add Mitra, and then I can add Nat Gale.
Yep.
Very good. Thank you.
And then I will open all rooms.
All right.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close that and hope that worked. We will find out from Nat later. So any other comments that people want to make, or I'll open up to conversation. I'm not monitoring the chat, but I know our team is. So if there's anything that comes through, Kristen or others, that you want to mention, feel free to go ahead and do that.
Yeah, I'll monitor the chat.
Great. So we're gonna dive into some cross sections or some initial ideas, which is sometimes where we get the most conversation about some initial view or concepts that we can think about for the corridor. Again, these are might change throughout the corridor, but for the most part, wanted to describe some different ways we can address Wilshire and La Cienega. So. I'll dive into Wilshire first. As you're probably well familiar with the corridor, but this is what the overall right-of-way is. There are 3 travel lanes in each direction and a center protected turn lane, left turn lane throughout the corridor. And then, of course, the 5-foot sidewalks, which is quite generous, actually. In a lot of urban areas, you don't have that. So you do have good sidewalk space, but it's a matter of how maybe we're breaking that down or treating it. And then there are some other ideas that we have around repurposing some of the lanes within the curb area. If we are looking at perhaps not taking a lane of travel, but we could consider bus priority lanes throughout the corridor. This is one way that could look, where we take the outside lane and that becomes a bus priority. It can serve a dual function there as well in the future. One of the things that's nice about this is as you think about that street edge and the pedestrian experience, when you have private motor vehicles going along that edge, they tend to go a little bit faster, a little bit louder along that rate adjacent to the pedestrian realm. And if we put buses there, there's just another sense of protection. It's a little bit slower in terms of how the buses operate, and feels a little bit more comfortable from a pedestrian perspective. Also, of course, as we think about transit through this corridor, where the bus stations are located along here, and how that zone right adjacent to the busway is treated will be really important. I might pause there for any comments that folks might have. Feel free to chat or unmute yourself. Chat in the dialog box, or feel free to unmute yourself. All right, I'll keep going on to another option that it may be considered as well, which is parallel parking. So this is an opportunity to maybe increase the sidewalk in certain areas and increase the landscaping, and also provide space for parked vehicles. So this would be one travel lane becomes repurposed to parking, and then also you can see what we call bump outs here, where you have landscaping options in that area, and that could happen at intersections, of course, to sort of narrow the pedestrian crossing areas. So the bump out would happen at intersections, and then along the corridor could happen as well, which again sort of narrows that the feeling of it being a car corridor, and it increases the pedestrian comfort along the edges as well. So one thing I did want to mention that we saw, and we've talked to a number of folks through the stakeholder meetings about the idea of a median. And that could happen in either of these configurations, any configuration throughout the corridor. There's a generous space between curb face to curb face throughout the corridor. So in some instances, this idea of a median could come into play, where we can still have the dedicated left turn lanes, but mid-block, there may be options for a landscaped median that becomes kind of an identity feature for Beverly Hills. I know that you do have that in some other areas, and we see them throughout other areas, of course, of Wilshire as well. I'll pause now for any comments on these two that we can look at together. Again, feel free to chat or, yeah, it looks like same. Do we have any additional folks who have joined the conversation? Looks like we got a chat. Okay, well, I'll keep going on La Cienega, and we can pause at the end, and we will be able to zoom into any of the different cross sections as you like, or other elements that we've talked about. La Cienega, not dissimilar to Wilshire in terms of its overall cross section. Again, 3 lanes in each direction, left turning, protected left turn, and then generous 15-foot sidewalks on either side. And one option here is that we could consider that idea of parallel parking throughout the corridor, where you provide parking along and adjacent to the building fronts, and allow for landscaping in between in some areas. Just break up the rhythm of the parking. Sometimes the landscape bump outs break down that parking so it doesn't feel like a sea of parking along the edge, and optically narrows the corridor, again having an effect on just how fast people are driving through the corridor. Still allows for the vehicle throughput that it seems like you need in this corridor. Another option is to even consider, in some areas, we could narrow that parking a little bit more and add a couple feet to the sidewalk, but in some instances we could fully some areas and really create a wide and generous sidewalk where you can have much greater cafe spill out space, retail spill out space, as if that seems like the appropriate intervention along La Cienega. So I'll pause there for any comments on any of the information that we've provided or gone over today. And we can zoom in to different areas of the white space that we're looking at here, if there's anything you want to talk about. Or I'd also offer to the design team, anything I missed or anything you want to bring up. There's a lot of people working in this space and doing a lot of different things. Great work from the team, and feel free to jump in if you want.
This is Kristen. I don't have a lot to add, but I was just looking through the participant list, and there's maybe 1 or 2 people who I don't recognize from the previous session. So please feel free to chat us or just speak up. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
Great, thanks, Kristen. And if you don't, if talking right now is not necessarily what you want to do, but you do want to provide feedback, there are multiple ways to do that. Of course, in the chat window here, you can chat to us privately. You can also chat to everyone in the group. There are other opportunities at the website, which is connectbeverlyhills.org. I think it's connect.beverlyhills.org. Well, this is very different for us than usually what we call an open, lively studio, where we're all in person and there's lots of conversation. So I'm gonna stop talking at this moment in time, unless anyone wants me to dive back into a different part of the presentation. And those who have been here, thank you so much for your time and your energy. Again, we hope you can tune back in for future events, which are, I'm going to go up to that page where we can look at what's going on tomorrow. We have another closing presentation tomorrow afternoon, which you'll see what we've presented today a little bit more refined as we're in process right now. And then we'll have additional stakeholder and community engagement efforts throughout the summer. And then another design charrette happening this fall likely in September. So other than that, I don't have much more to cover, so we'll stop the formal presentation. And thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
Anybody that wants to talk about the trees maybe want to stay on. It's something I kind of forgot to tell you.
Yeah. Right.
Please.
Okay, you'll notice that the existing palms are planted in clusters in certain areas.
Yeah.
And, hang on just a second here.
My Google Earth is not working, but we could look at that.
I'm doing sound mitigation here. But you'll notice that some of the trees are planted in clusters. And when they put them in, it's pretty clear that they planted 2 or 3, went in as 8, 10, 12 footers. But when they planted them in clusters, they didn't account for the fact that they would compete with each other. And so if you look closely, you'll see that the trunk of the trees narrow a bit at the spot where they were about the height they were when they went in. Of course, palm trees reestablishing tend to do that. They do this a little bit and then go up. The palms that we've had do poorly and develop structural issues do that at that point where the canopies were trying to get away from each other. So you have a hinge point. I wrote a paper about all this. If anyone's that weird that they would care how palm trees move in the wind mechanically. But you have these pivot points where the trees start drooping way over when they seed up and that kind of thing. So if you're going to follow that model again and try to replicate it, make sure that the palm canopies are wide enough where they don't have photosynthetic competition that results in these pivot points and weird structural abnormalities.
That's fascinating, Ken. I'm glad you bring that up, and actually I would love to read this paper.
Be the second one. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. But yeah, something to consider. I think one of the things we'll want to think about is what is sort of the short-term strategy, or what is sort of a retrofit to what's existing, and then are there longer-term strategies, which is kind of handling and dealing with maybe the what you're talking about and the placement of that and how we do it so that they're healthy and can establish.
I think there's been about 60 trees displaced through the project, and I talked about this a little bit yesterday. We try to, there's a master plan in town in some of the palm streets where the strategy was to take the streets that have been most impacted by number of palms lost and then put them in at one time and fill vacancies. And as additional trees are lost, you add on footage so you don't end up with the calliope effect. But I think you're going to see on overall where you're talking about getting outside of the station and moving down the street, there's going to be some opportunities when those trees are put back in to think about what happens here, and that'll give you some continuity down the street, because short of that, there will be none.
Yeah, great points. Thank you. Appreciate that, and all your knowledge you have of the trees in this area.
Anne had a question, if it's okay to move on. Yeah, so she asks, has Metro committed to funding first and last mile improvements in Beverly Hills? And thanks for the meetings.
That is a great question. I don't know if Malia is on the line. She's our deputy project manager on this. I don't have direct knowledge of that. Maybe you do, Kristen, or Malia if she's on the line. But that would be a question for Nat, and we'll make sure to we can circle back with you if no one can answer it right at this time. Yeah, I think Malia might be in a stakeholder meeting. So we'll be sure to get back to you, Anne, on that and let you know what we know. Other comments, questions? All right, well, I think we'll leave it there. We're ending about 20 minutes early. The design team will stay on the line if you have any questions, but otherwise we can consider the meeting, the open studio. The doors are still open, but feel free, like the presentation is done. Thank you.
Sorry, Anne just had a last comment for Ken. And she says, be sure to check out Metro's contractor encamped on the McCarthy Vista median at Crescent Heights in Wilshire. There's gas methane construction without proper protection for the existing trees. Just a warning to Beverly Hills about protecting trees from Metro.
Well, and it's actually quite serious. I don't know if there are any existing trees on these areas that we've been discussing, but Beverly Hills does a good job. They have better standards for real estate development to protect existing trees. Nice to meet you, Ken. You can maybe speak to that better than me. But
yeah, I'm not popular with developers. There's a poster out there that offers a reward for me.
Yeah, that's
less than what you see now.
Well, that's okay. You're a hero for tree lovers then. But anyway, I don't know if you guys have the methane. I don't think you have the methane gas problem there. I think it's more towards the La Brea tar pits.
I don't want to get too in depth here, but you can tell Rob Welch, it shows up in here. He's the engineer, the project engineer for Metro that represents the city.
Oh, he's on the meeting?
He also answers to Darren, and we have communication regularly. So,
and I've taken note, and you know, as you mentioned, they're at this time they're not venting methane, but we will be on the lookout if for some reason conditions change as they excavate.
Yeah, and I'm just saying in general to watch out for existing trees.
Absolutely.
Got it.
Takes too long to grow trees. Do you think the city of Beverly Hills, what size canopy trees would they be planting, do you think?
That's a great question. I don't think we've gotten that far. I think there are some examples already within the area, and I know, and maybe Ken can speak to this, the idea of street trees that do well. We'd want to know from the city what those are and what we can consider throughout this corridor.
So typically, the standard for planting a tree says that you would dig the hole 2.5 times the width of the container that it's in. So the width of the parkway or tree well controls a lot of that. But you see in the narrower parkways of the city, we typically plant 36-inch box trees. And then in the wider ones, we plant 48-inch box trees. Now you'll hear people saying that, well, you can get larger trees, but it's my experience that the nursery, this is kind of an interesting concept when you think about it. Let's say you go to the nursery and there's a bunch of baby trees in pots this big. Who picks what they perceive as to be the worst tree? Anyone?
Not usually.
So if there's 100 trees, the 10 that are left that nobody's buying are the ones that get moved up into the next size, right?
Yep.
So what happened to the 90 that were picked before that? You're starting to do the math here on this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so you end up with trees that are moved up and boxed up and things, but it's my experience that once you start getting into these huge box trees that are pulled out of someone's yard, I mean, most people don't allow trees to be salvaged out of their yard unless the place is going to be bulldozed or something like that. And most places that are bulldozed don't usually have a state quality landscaping care. So the idea that you would go in and buy up big box trees, maybe that's something for a courtyard or something like that. But we have pretty good luck in the city. I'm blessed with the resources that I need to plant bigger trees right away, more than other places. So City Council takes good care of me on that. But to answer the question, typically the trees that go in are 36-inch or 48-inch boxes.
And maybe the question is also around different types of species that you've seen thrive in the local condition.
Part of the urban forest management plan that's going in right now is you want to remember that the first trees were planted in the city in 1907. So you can kind of take a look around at, say, Maple Drive, which is a beautiful street, but bigger trees that have gone through some root cuttings, and we space root cuttings to fix things so we don't go in and cut 3 sides of a tree off and stuff. But we've got pretty good experience with a pallet of trees that work here. The water resources are very different now. We're going to be looking at, I think I hinted at this the other day. I'm not burning up presentation time here, I hope, but
not at all. No, this is great.
We're kind of looking at, I've seen master plans developed in the city. The master plan looks like this. We have a problem with the tree type. If we have some attrition on a street where there is one type of tree, and we lose a tree here and there, and we replace them in kind, but when it becomes a problem that the tree isn't suitable anymore, we kind of pick a palette of trees that might work there and then open it up to the public for input and voting. So we're known for that process. One of the most frustrating things is if you come into a city and go to work there and you have to replace trees, is this idea that because you go to the nursery or saw the picture of a tree in a book, that there's going to be a supply there for you long term. So part of your consideration is not only the type of tree, but which trees are going to be available in numbers you want. And then of course you want to remember developers come running in with cash where cities plan and do things like that. So you've got to have a good grasp on your market. We know some trees that will do well down in there. Again, we talked about the fact that we would have irrigation, because I think the days of thinking that there's an underground river that waters the trees, or that there's enough leaks in the building to keep the trees alive, I think those days are gone. And I also think the setbacks in those areas call for trees that aren't huge, but are mid-size and more water efficient, but yet offer.
Ken, do you think the city could put in underground cisterns while they're redesigning the street?
I think that there's some talk of that. Were you involved in the green streets? Have you seen that effort?
No, now I realize where we started, where tree nerds are talking now. I called you when we were trying to find a Morton fig a few months ago when for the San Vincent median.
How did you do?
We're still looking, but I left the space open because we need a Morton fig, ever since that tree died.
AY down in Riverside had some. We're talking about these ficus trees that get humongous, like the one over in Beverly Gardens Park. We planted one to be the centennial tree. So, I mean, if you really wanted to do someone poorly, you would plant one of these trees in the yard because they turn into one of these giant trees.
But the storm drain, when they design the sidewalks around the metro, maybe there could be a system for watering, or is that just a fantasy?
Go to beverlyhills.org and look up green streets. And I think you're going to see some of that in the development of the Burton Way median.
Oh yeah, okay, thanks, very cool.
The city's good about being really transparent with their plans and projects. I like that.
You're awesome.
Thanks, Ken.
Can I ask one more tree nerd question? I'm totally sorry. This is for Ken. The other day on this session, Phil from the Hysterical Society mentioned this super old tree on La Cienega near Olympic. It's gone now, but he said it was one of the oldest trees in LA. Had you ever heard that story before?
No, the oldest trees in Beverly Hills are the palms on North Beverly and Cannon, as well as the trees in the 4 blocks of Beverly Gardens Park, including the big Morton Bay fig.
I think the story that Ann's talking about, this is Ken from Tool Design. I was facilitating that conversation with Phil and Ann the other night. And it's that dirt lot that's there at Olympic, that there was a tree that was there that was humongous, I guess, and they got cut down in the 40s. And that lot hasn't ever been developed, he thought, because of that history of that tree location. And then I guess the county line or the city line kind of, jogging there at Olympic and in the park. But
I know, Phil. I'll check in with him. I mean, I look old, but I wasn't there.
Wonderful. Awesome. Well, I see Nat and Mitra have returned. And so just to give you a sense of, we've just had a few questions. We've run through the presentation again. And I think we're pretty close to wrapping up. If there's any closing words, Nat, that you want to provide, or it looks like we have a couple of different chats perhaps.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, I would just say, thanks everybody. This has been a very productive week already, and we've got one day left, just in terms of the conversations around what we've learned, in what, again, literally what we've discovered from all the different perspectives on street and sidewalk needs, different community interests. I appreciate everybody hanging with us. I think, Anne, you've been here from the beginning. You definitely get the award for, who's sticking with us. Nicole, I think, has been here at least today from the beginning as well, and Mitra too. So, I think the one thing that I'll say that's really, really important is, please continue to stay involved. Mitra and I just had a great conversation. We exchanged information. We're at the very beginning of this design process. We're just going to be getting started after all of our work discovering this week. So it's going to take us throughout the course of the summer to iterate over those design concepts, to continue to have conversations. We've got another team member, Community Arts Resources, who's going to be really leading some of that engagement work. So we'll keep an eye out for information from them. Visit our website, connect.beverlyhills.org. All of the recordings from today, from yesterday, from Monday, are going to be available there. That's also where we'll be publishing any additional events for the project. We do have one final public session tomorrow from 5 to 6:30, where we'll iterate a little bit more, and please bring a friend with you. I think the thing that's really important about this, I had a couple conversations with different city council members, and they clearly want this plan to be informed and driven by the community voice. They've had a couple of projects where a lot of work is done, and then it comes to city council, and they hear that oh, nobody's heard of this, nobody is why weren't we engaged with, why weren't we informed? And I think it's our job to make sure that we're extending the breadth of our engagement, our conversations, as wide as possible, and we need your help in that. We need your participation in that as well. So thank you very much for being here. I think that is all that I have to say. I think we've been at it for a while, so really appreciate everybody's contributions. And Anne, whether it's chiming in the chat box or I'm glad you spoke up over the phone today. Appreciate your participation. Like I said, to bring a couple friends with you tomorrow. That would definitely make my heart sing at the end of the week. So I think with that, unless there's anything else, we can adjourn for the evening. Give everybody looks like 7 minutes back in their day. So yeah.
Great. Thanks, Nat. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Have a great evening.